quickly, so I guess this is just technology taking over again. So I normally start these sessions by asking participants what are their main issues with searching, like what are the things that trip you up or that you don't feel confident about, and so forth. And I know that we're not doing that right now or during this session, but I would expect that some of the questions that you have around literature searching are, do I really have to use subject headings? What's the advantage? I always get too much, or I get too much in terms of retrieval, and how can I narrow it down? You know, I don't feel confident as to which headings I should really use, and that's why I rely on sort of my Google approach of just typing in the first words that come to mind. And if you're don't have those questions and all of your literature searches turn out perfectly, well, hopefully I will give you one or two tips in this session. As Jason alluded to, I have prepared a PubMed search handout, and I've done this for years and continue to do so because I find that if you have a handout with pictures, so I take screenshots of every spot that you're on and give you a reason why you should be, following this particular step or what the screen will look like, I find that that helps to cement some of the searching tips. So that will be available to you, and on some of my slides you will see a page number listed, and that corresponds to that PubMed handout for more details. So as an overall goal, the point of today's session is to try and increase your searching effectiveness and the techniques to find the best clinical evidence. I'm going to mention some of the literature database searching features that are available that could help in that process, and touch very briefly on citation management software. I often say in these sessions that citation management software, so EndNote, Mendeley, Zotero, they help with your mental health, and it is a mental health issue. If you can organize your citations so that they don't, give you hives, that really is a time saver. So the specific objectives, you can have a look at these. You've all heard of PICO, but you may not all have heard of concept maps. And this is something that the concept map approach in trying to determine your search terms is more generic, and sometimes it's more logical for some of your questions. If you have a therapy question, PICO works very, very well. That's why it was developed. I'm often asked how many databases are enough. So I'm going to suggest the top 3 to you. Again, the difference between subject headings and text words and where they're more effective. The 4 pillars of evidence-based practice, which I'm sure you all know by heart, but just a quick review. Which quality filters that you can use with these pillars that will help with the power searching part of the process. Using automatic updates, whether it's through PubMed or the Ovid search platform or ProQuest or EBSCOhost, any of the ones you have access to, can certainly minimize the amount of time you spend searching for additional references. It's one of the things that we normally consider if you're doing a project, systematic review, guideline, but it's not something that you necessarily think of for everyday applications. And of course, citation management. This is a very idealized slide in terms of how research should flow and the timeline. And it is idealized because in actual fact, it's never as neat as this flow diagram. I sometimes think it looks a little bit like a frantic EEG because you're zigzagging back and forth between finding something and not finding something and trying to decide whether this question should be pursued a little bit further and so on. So typically you get your research idea or there's a clinical scenario that comes up and you ask yourself, why is it important? Do I have to do anything more? Is it feasible to either develop a study or is it feasible to research this further? Typically you would discuss it with colleagues, or sometimes you get voluntold that this is a topic that you should look at. And then when it comes to searching the literature, I don't know how many of you go solo or if you speak to the institutional librarian, whether at the hospital or university that you're affiliated with, but it's good to get a bit of a dialogue going as well. and you run a preliminary search. So what do you have up to that point in time? And that helps you to, scope out the environment, to evaluate what has been written, what the gaps are. Has it been covered in enough detail, and you probably shouldn't bother and move on to another topic. So again, if you find if there are studies found, then can you do a revision, or do you pursue a new research idea? And if there are no studies found, and you search more than once on this to make sure that you don't have a false drop here, then you proceed with the search and you start running more comprehensive literature searches. So this is the scenario that we're going to be working with, the sample question for today. And I've deliberately picked a pediatric question, and this is actually how it was phrased when I received it. And it was, as you can see, quite general. So most of people undergoing cancer chemotherapy are more susceptible to infections. I want to know if there are any studies evaluating the prophylactic use of antibiotics to prevent these infections. Reading this, it makes perfect sense to you, but in terms of actually structuring a search around it, you're going to have to do some work to massage these concepts into actual searchable terms, and you're going to have to decide how much background information do you need and how much of this question is the foreground question, if you will. So what do I mean by a background question? A background question is what you can think of as reference items that you need to know. Whereas the foreground question would be something like with specific antibiotics, do you want to look at? Are there specific infections that you want to look at? Is there a specific oncology population that you want to look at? Okay. So one of the ways to determine what some of these search terms are is if you take what you have written down, or sometimes if you can write down what I call the aha title. If you saw the title of this article on a screen in front of you, you'd say, aha, that's the article that I want to read. And you would underline it, or in this case I've color-coded it, so I know that any articles of interest to me would be articles that are in the pediatric population, in children, about the oncology population, so children with cancer, any infections, and I wanted to look at the prophylactic use of antibiotics, because really what I'm looking for is just try and prevent the infections before they start. So if we look at, what is the research rationale? So is this a clinical scenario or a clinical situation where you've just noticed an increase and you just want to see what's the latest in the literature? You would probably be doing a fairly, focused and short search on this. However, if you were looking at a systematic review or looking at guideline preparation, you would have to look at a more detailed and more comprehensive search. And while determining what the search terms would be the same process, certainly the number of databases that you would search and how much additional terminology or words, search terms you would use would be very different. So in terms of asking yourself, well, what are some of the background questions and where would I find that information? One of the things that most people do routinely, but sometimes it's easy to forget, is are there any existing guidelines? And there are a variety of resources for this. The National Guideline Clearinghouse, it's not 100% comprehensive, but they certainly do try their best to list most of them. And they do include Canadian guidelines. Your internal intranets probably have clinical practice guidelines, which you should become familiar with. And then certainly searching the subject databases like Medline or MBase, because a lot of societies or associations will publish their guidelines in their journal. Are you looking for institutional practice? Well, that sometimes is more of a subject database search. Hospital X is using this, hospital Y is doing that. Certainly you would want to check if there are any systematic reviews or meta-analyses done, and of course Cochrane is our first go-to there. I know it isn't top-heavy always in pediatric topics, but nevertheless it's one that you could start. And how much start searching, and how much can you extrapolate from the adult literature that would be applicable for peds? Drug safety and interactions. So certainly your hospital formulary or the CPS, if you have a subscription to it, would certainly give you that information. ToxNet and ChemID, ToxNet is available for free from the American government, from NIH. ChemID is part of ToxNet, and that's basically a chemical dictionary. And that has a lot of useful information in it, and it's a source that we tend to forget about. And I was reminded of it at another session that I did just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to show a slide about some of the information that's available there. Are we looking at antibiotics versus other preventative measures? So, you know, that again would be a Medline search, but that's a slightly different question from what we had written down in our clinical scenario. We were just looking at the use of prophylactic antibiotics. If we just search for that, are you introducing a bias into your search? Are you eliminating some literature that might be useful? And I'm thinking here specifically of the care for catheters, because a lot of the infections are port infections. So is there something you can be doing around the catheter as opposed to giving the children a course of prophylactic antibiotics? And if you're looking at supportive care, are there, you know, or do you need to look at supportive care? Are there some issues around the provision of supportive care that you could introduce for this question? So you see, it's not always just the terms that you've thought of and written down. You do have to sort of think around the perimeters of the question. And I specifically use the term avoid bias because there's nothing worse than running a search and only looking at one aspect or one side of the coin and forgetting about the other side. And you can potentially miss references that way. So I mentioned ChemID, ToxNet and ChemID, and this is a screenshot of the ToxNet page, the ChemID portion of it, and it gives you sort of background information on this particular drug, rituximab, which I chose. But what, and hopefully my pointer, no, it does work. One segment of it, liver tox, the point of ChemID is that it provides you with reference values, but it also provides you with links to the literature. So you see that there's Medline Plus, ID, and so forth. And here with liver tox, they actually give you sort of the levels of liver toxicity, and they will give you the reference article. So that could be a good source to just quickly find some background information. But Drug Bank is the one I'd like to highlight because that's actually from Health and Welfare Canada. And on the next page, you'll see that one of the sections over here includes drug interactions. So what it's giving you is a list of all of the drug interactions with rituximab of these additional medications. And as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, there are a number of pages. So again, this is perhaps information that you have in your formulary, but this is another source. And I'd like to highlight it just so that you don't forget about what's available out there for free. Moving along, step 3, you translate the research question into a searchable question. And as I mentioned, we are all familiar with PICO and maybe less so with concept maps. The first two, PICO and concept map, are very amenable to quantitative research questions. So we use them in order to organize the concepts that we have to search for and in preparation of finding the appropriate vocabulary or text word terms that we need to use. The last three, Spice, Spider, and Eclipse, are really kind of cute names, but what they are developed for are more qualitative searching topics. So as you can see, Spice evaluates the outcomes of a service or a project or an intervention. Spider is more for qualitative research for samples rather than populations. And Eclipse investigates the outcomes of a policy or service. So it's good to keep these in mind, and there are many, many more, but it depends on what the focus of your question is. Is it quantitative or is it qualitative? And you can use these acronyms or mnemonics to help determine, again, what terms you actually need to search for, what you need to consider. So if we go back to our question, these are some of the questions. Certainly, if you came to me with this search topic, these are some of the first questions that I would be asking you. So do you want all types of cancer? Or do you want to limit to leukemias or brain tumors, et cetera? Are you looking at only bacterial infections versus fungal infections? Or do you want both? And if you search for both, are there any inherent differences between the way children will respond to one or the other? You know, if you give an antifungal, can you also give an antibacterial? Can they have both at the same time, et cetera? Because as a non-clinician, I don't know the answers to these questions. I would be asking you. Do we want to include, stemming from the bacterial and fungal infections, do you need to include antibiotics or antifungals, or are there any off-label medications that you can use that don't fall into these two classes? Or do you need to compare two specific drugs, or do you want everything on antibiotics, let's say? Or classes of antibiotics, would that make a difference in your search results? One of the main questions usually is, do you want to include transplant? And does that mean that you want to include or exclude graft versus host infections, because that adds an extra dimension of complication, right? I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but again, I would ask these questions. And as I alluded to before, do you want to exclude catheter infections? I mean, because there is a large body of literature there. So what is it that you really need? And if you think of these ahead of time before you start running your search and or before you come to a librarian to help you run the search, it will help inform how you structure the actual search query and presumably give you better results. So in my executive decision-making capacity here, this is what I decided. I wasn't going to limit to any specific type of cancer. I was going to include all neoplasms in children. I was going to only look at bacterial infections. And I did not want to look at any specific antibiotics, and I was going to exclude transplant by not including transplant or graft versus host, and I wasn't specifically looking for catheter infections. I just wanted any bacterial infections regardless of how they occurred. So just in quick review, PICO was developed for therapy questions. What do I mean by therapy? Population or patient A, intervention B, comparison C, outcome B. Concept maps are more generic, and they can be applied for not only therapy questions but also diagnosis questions or maybe some prognosis questions. They're logical and they have strong expandability. So this is what our PICO analysis would look like. We would want cancer in children ages 0 to 18. I want all antibiotics. I'm not looking at a comparison here. My outcome is I want to prevent bacterial infections. And for time, I kind of smushed in here prophylaxis and chemoprevention. I didn't have a specific time frame in mind. It's just, you know, the prophylactic use. And the power search will be the evidence-based pillars and the therapy filters that are the filters that are available for searching these pillars. The concept map maybe looks a bit messier, but it actually is more of a working document. And what you do is you basically range along the top, you know, the main topics. So going back to that clinical scenario, research scenario that we had at the beginning, what are the main topics of concern that must be discussed in the article? And below that, you would list, for example, here under synonyms and research terms, any of the additional terms that you feel would be useful to include in your search. And it's basically planning an outline of your search. So what are these evidence-based pillars and study designs? I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They were developed by the Cochrane Collaboration and McMaster University in the late 70s and early 80s. And of note for searching is that in the late 1980s, so about 1986-87, both the Cochrane Collaboration and McMaster approached the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland, so the group that puts together Medline. And they said, look, we have an evidence-based movement growing. The studies are following specific designs, the methods that they're using. There is a growing body of literature available, and we have to be able to systematically extract that literature from the articles that you're indexing in Medline, and they obviously went to other subject database providers as well. But we need these terms to be used, and these are the definitions of these terms, and we need them to be used consistently and systematically. And so these terms were adapted, and I'm talking specifically about things like randomized control trials, cohort studies, retrospective studies, longitudinal studies, etc. And they have been added to the indexing vocabulary of these databases. They are available in a variety of formats now. So if you go into PubMed, you'll see a section called Clinical Queries. And the full list is available on page 34 of that PubMed handout. Now, the PubMed queries clinical queries have been revised over the years, and they've gotten a bit broader. So what I've listed are the way that they were listed originally from McMaster. And we find in clinical settings that they usually are a little more focused. Whereas the clinical queries, the version that's available on PubMed and also in Ovid, they're a bit broader and they're excellent for systematic reviews, but they do retrieve a higher yield of references. Of course, there's the Cochrane Handbook, again, primarily therapy related, but the search filters, and I've given you the reference on the slide. But something that you should investigate if you haven't already is that various institutions, be they universities or hospital libraries, have actually saved these search terms as saved searches on the search platforms. Not so much in PubMed, but in Ovid, where they're saved as expert searches. And they are available to you if you use that search interface. You go in through your institution, use that search interface, you can pull these up very quickly and just add them. It's like opening a saved Word document, and then you just add it to your search. You combine your subject search with these filtered terms. I've also given you an example. There are some of the library pages, for example, University of Alberta, there's the CRD in the UK. They do list some of these other search filters, and you can certainly copy those terms and incorporate them into your search. What a number of institutions also do, not only for these search filters, the quality searching filters, but they have also developed search strategies for commonly searched topics. So, for example, First Nations tribe names or Aboriginal groups, they sometimes save those searches on their institutional platform. So if you're running a search on First Nations, you have all of the search terms available to you, and it's a very quick way to make sure that you're comprehensive. So just as a very quick review, the evidence-based pillars and the study designs associated with them are available on this slide. So if you look at diagnosis, there's sensitivity and specificity. So some of the headings are predictive value of tests, ROC curve. Diagnostic errors, there's false negatives, false positives. If you look at therapy, I mean, those are much more familiar to you for RCTs, CCTs, multi-center studies, etc. And under prognosis and etiology, or etiology, causation, harm, it's sometimes called, the main sort of timeline, if you will, is that it's a cohort study, that there is a group that has been followed through consistently over a period of time, and they're looking for sort of general outcome or risk terms. And there's a very, very long list under the prognosis. The risk terms are much shorter, but again, these are all in your handout, and you can have a look at them at your leisure. So in step 5, we're looking to select our resources. So what's the best, what are the best resources for us? Well, when it comes to subscription versus open access sources, most of you are in large institutions, and you probably have subscription access to the first 4 that are on this page. So Cochrane, BMJ, Clinical Evidence, UpToDate, Dynamed. Cochrane and BMJ evidence are more sort of journal article focused, if you will, and they are much more current in the sense that they have literature being added to them on, a fairly standardized updating frequency daily or weekly. UpToDate and Dynamed are more of a reference or textbook type approach to information on your topic. It's good for an overall review, but it doesn't necessarily give you the latest article that was just indexed and uploaded the day before. When it comes to the open access sources, again, we're looking at National Guideline Clearinghouse, the ToxNet, and TRIP. TRIP is turning research into practice, and it was a fabulous sort of mega search engine in that it would give you Cochrane reviews, it would give you guidelines from National Guideline Clearinghouse and some journal articles. But it has gone to partial subscription, and so the free part of it is not that easy to search anymore, and it gives you limited resources. You have to have a subscription to it to get the full range. So take that with a grain of salt, I guess. When it comes to the actual journal databases, there are much more complete descriptions starting on page 10 of the PubMed handout. But the top three for most of your clinical searches would be the Cochrane Library, Medline, and Embase. You're all familiar with Cochrane. The systematic reviews, whether they're available on your topic or not, is, it depends on the question you're asking. But certainly the Central Trials Register has a compilation of RCTs that Cochrane Collaboration Disease Study Groups have identified, and it is a sort of self-contained and a manageable number of references. So that should be one spot that you certainly look at first. The difference between Medline and Embase is they're both biomedical databases. Medline tends to be our workhorse. It's available for free on PubMed, so most people go to it first off. But the difference between the two is that Embase is larger. It has something like 9,000 journals that they index, whereas Medline is around 6,700 or so. But the drug coverage in Embase is much greater and deeper than in Medline. And let's face it, in oncology, you have a lot of the drugs that end in INIB and MAB that you're using, and there is more literature indexed in Embase. I see it in virtually all the searches that I run. The other advantage, which is both an advantage and a disadvantage in Embase, is that they do include conference abstracts. And quite often that is, as you know, the quickest way to find out about the latest that people are reporting. But it can be equally frustrating because there's just the abstract and there may not be a published paper yet. So I would encourage you to look at both, and you will get different results. CINAHL is Cumulative Index to Nursing and Allied Health, and it is more of a qualitative research database. So if you're looking at supportive care or quality of life, then it's not one that you should discount easily, because it does have additional literature that you won't find in the other two. Nursing is covered in Medline and Embase, but there's always a slightly different spin from the CINAHL perspective. PsycInfo is put out by the American Psychological Association, and again, this for supportive care or quality of life questions is a good database to search. It's not top-heavy in the clinical terms or the disease terms, so you don't get a lot of retrieval, but you will get different citations. The other thing that both CINAHL and PsycInfo include are dissertations. So if you're looking for an instrument or a questionnaire to measure X, Y, or Z, so not so much for this topic, but for other questions that you may have, you will get references or citations to the dissertations, which, of course, can be quite useful. I've also included clinicaltrials.gov. If there's a new trial or trial that's recruiting and hasn't published anything yet, well, again, a bit of a double-edged sword, but at least you have a contact, and perhaps they'll be willing to share some of the preliminary results. The last one is one that we tend to forget about in North America. It's the World Health Organization Global Index Medicus. So it's all of their regional Index Medicus, which is the previous incarnation of Medline. The advantage here is that in under-resourced or developing countries, they sometimes have to come up with very low-cost initiatives in order to manage their patients, so they don't always have the latest drugs available to them. And it's interesting to see what you can discover in this database. The search interface is not as sophisticated as some, but you will get the literature from the Caribbean, from the Mediterranean, from parts of Africa, and so on. And it certainly, whenever I have to run a systematic review, I am, for certain topics, that's one of the places I go to first. The disadvantage is that the articles tend to be in whatever the local language is, so it's a lot of Spanish and Portuguese, some Chinese, and so forth. But you can always try and get some of that translated. And also ask your librarian what other databases are available. So what I'm showing you here on this particular slide is to try and help you focus and think about what is it that you're actually searching. So if you think of the first page of a journal article, the information that you typically find is the author, the title, the abstract, and somewhere top or bottom, the journal in which it appears. The value-added component of this citation, if it were indexed, let's say in Medline, is that the indexers at the National Library of Medicine actually have that article in hand, whether electronically or print. And they read through it and they decide on the basis of the text, okay, this article talks about A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They then take those topics and translate them into the actual mesh or subject heading terms available in that database. And the advantage of that is that they have that article in front of them. They know this literature exists. By providing you with the access points in all of these fields, because Medline is a database, so it's a field with data in that field, you can search through all of it or in portions of it to try and retrieve that article matching the search question that you have. So if we look at this one, you'll see that they didn't refer to it as antibiotic prophylaxis. It was antibacterial prophylaxis. So if you just typed in prophylactic antibiotics, you would not get it from the title. You may or may not get it from the abstract. But if you typed in prophylactic antibiotics in either PubMed in the MESH database or in Ovid in the search box, it would probably route you to the actual subject heading that is available, which is antibiotic prophylaxis. So what's the advantage of using a subject term versus a text word? In text word searching, you're at the mercy of what words the author used. Whereas with a subject heading, you have a standardized approach to describing the literature using the specific subject terms. Where do these subject terms come from? International Classification of Diseases, the DSM-5, all standardized terms, okay? So again, just as a review, try and use the MESH database in PubMed or the tools function in Ovid or the search subject headings in EBSCOhost, whatever search platform you're using, as the consistent and comprehensive way into finding the actual search terms that the indexers in the database would be using. It is getting at the guts of the article as opposed to trying to float over words that either appear or don't appear in the title or the abstract. Check the scope notes for the term, the definition, and the indexing history. How long has it been in use? Is it only a new term from 2016, or has it been around since 1996, as is the case for our term for antibiotic prophylaxis? There's something called the tree listing. It's like a family tree of all of the subject headings that are available in the database. That's when you decide how many members of this family have to come along for the search. Am I only searching for the general term antibiotics, or am I including every single antibiotic that's listed there? Okay? And if you don't include all of the antibiotics, well, then you're limiting your search results. If you look at text wording, in this case, we have antibiotic prophylaxis, which has only been a mesh term since 1996. Do we need to go back before 1996 in this search, or will 1996 to the present suffice? Be very careful how you answer that question. There was one very horrible example at Johns Hopkins University in the late 1990s where they were running an asthma study, and they had done a search on this drug, which happened to be a cardiac drug in the first place, and they wanted to try it out in asthma, and they were searching for any adverse effects in control subjects. And lo and behold, they stopped searching PubMed at the time, only went back to 1960, and in 1959 was a definitive article that said it was very dangerous for control subjects. They missed that article, and unfortunately a 26-year-old lab assistant who was the third of the control group was administered the drug and died a couple of weeks later. So a very extreme case, but it happened, and that's one of the reasons why PubMed now goes back to the 1940s and earlier. That was one of the recommendations in that investigation, and NLM went back and put everything online. So be very, very careful about the year. One thing that you will find very useful in most search interfaces is what's called proximity operators. This allows you to state your text word search so that you are accommodating grammar. So in this case, antibiotic asterisk, which is the truncation symbol in Ovid, ADJ adjacent 3, meaning 3 words of prophyla, truncated at the A for prophylactic, prophylaxis, will give you prophylactic use of antibiotics, or will give you antibiotic prophylaxis side by each. This is not available in PubMed. There are no proximity operators available. The most you can do is enclose your phrase in quotation marks. So if you want to do a proper text word search in PubMed, you would have to type in all the variations of that phrase. And even if you do that and you think it's clean, the word algorithm in PubMed will kick in and it will give you additional results that quite often are false drops. But that's just a search platform issue. And the one thing that I can't emphasize enough is that you cannot use the same subject terms across databases. You must select them individually for each database. You will get results, but they won't be the right results. So you need to keep these points in mind as you're actually structuring your search. Of course, Boolean operators, Venn diagrams from geometry days, we can't get away from them. Remember that OR is more. So if you're ORing terms together, you're asking for everything on either one of those terms. When you're ANDing, you're intersecting the circles. And quite often, when you're typing it in quickly, you're going to type in AND when you really mean or vice versa. So just watch that, and it helps when you're preparing your search to draw this Venn diagram and actually look at, what are the terms that you want to be included in that article? Are they an or are they an and? And sometimes you'll come up with a number of variations that you never thought possible. So, having talked about all of these points or concepts in searching and how to prepare for it, this is the actual search that I ran in PubMed. And if you look, and we'll start at the bottom, if you had just typed in prophylactic antibiotics in pediatric cancer, so kind of the Google approach, you would have found 70 references. If we limited to clinical trials, that knocks it down to 13, and you think, okay, that's good. That's a small enough number. I can look at those. I'll probably find what I need. But let's take it a step further, and let's actually run the search as you would using the subject headings. So in set number 3, these are all my articles on neoplasms. In set number 4, I've actually looked for the subject heading, antibiotic prophylaxis. In step number 5, I've combined them, and I have 857 references. Now, I've taken it a step further because I see that here antibiotic prophylaxis only goes back to 96. So what I've done is I've searched for antibacterial agents, which are my antibiotics, and there is a second component that you have to search for, which is antibacterial agents pharmacological action. This is a new term that or concept that came in about 3 or 4 years ago. And what it really means, I think, in the bottom line, is that any of the drugs that are not actual subject headings, they sort of lump them into this category. So you should be searching for both. Chemoprevention was the previously used indexing term for antibiotic prophylaxis, and I've added text wording on prophyla, chemoprevent, and chemoprophyla, because I found as I was looking through some references that it was also called that. It's not very commonly used, but it's there. So my set 8 is the previous indexing approach to this topic. So my cancer, my neoplasm terms, my antibiotics in number 6, and number 7, the chemoprevention. And I end up with 1,900 plus references. So set number 9, I've combined the results of my antibiotic prophylaxis number 5 and number 8. Now I've limited to children and to clinical trials, and I end up with 162 total. I've now decided that I need to look at the other sort of approach to this. So rather than going through the front door, I'm trying to go in the back door and see if I come up with anything extra. So here I'm looking for prevention and control of bacterial infections. I'm going to combine that in set 12 with my neoplasm terms because I only want it in oncology patients. And again, I'm going to limit to clinical trials and the age group, and I end up with 106. So now my question here in number 14 is, how many of those 106 were not in my group of 162 and by extension in my group of 13? And I come up with 61 references. So you can see by doing the search and looking at it from different angles, I am getting different results. So what do these results look like? Well, the first one that I found was from my initial set of 13 references. And you can see that it does include the transplant population, which I wasn't particularly interested in. But that's okay. It picked it up anyway because they're indexed to cancer, to neoplasms, and to the antibiotics. In my group of set 10, my group of 162 references, where I used all of the subject headings, including the previous indexing, I come up with this article that looks like it might be relevant. It is limited to leukemia, but there it is. In my last set, where I broadened it out to prevention and control of bacterial infections, so I wasn't looking specifically at antibiotics. I was looking at anything, any intervention. This is where I found some of my catheter prevention techniques or practices. And this may or may not be what you want, but it certainly is giving you another look or another sort of perspective on the topic. So in summary, if you're looking at a topic, think of the front door, the back door, and maybe even a side door. What other aspects do you need to look at in order to get the full picture? Downloading, saving your results, all things that you probably do automatically. A lot of people will review the references on the search screen and just select only certain ones that they want, which is fine. Sometimes what I recommend is that you download everything into a citation management, like an EndNote or whatever you're using, or even as a Word document, because then you can look at it in a more timely fashion, in the sense that you're not rushing, you're not going to time out on the screen, you're not going to necessarily get called away, and then you can go back and review the hits. Always try and remember, especially if you're doing a systematic review or guideline, to download or save your search strategy for future use. If you download it and save it as a Word document, you can add it to the appendix of your article, and that will give transparency in people, and people can replicate the search. So I mean, you want some knowledge translation going on here as well. Saving your searches for an automatic update, whether it's through PubMed or through the Ovid interface, will save you time in the long run. If it's a project that you know is ongoing, then that's the perfect way to move forward in time. Saving a search for just a general topic of interest is also a good way to move forward, and I'll show you a slide about using electronic table of contents alerting. It's sometimes easier to set up an auto alert or a saved search to come once a month. You're more likely to read it than if it's coming up at you 2 or 3 times a day every time a new EPUB is added. And a real time saver is if you have a recurring search question. So for example, if you treat primarily leukemia patients, so let's say AML or ALL, whatever it is, you can come up with the search headings that you would normally use and some text words and just save it as a saved search. And every time you need to run a search on your leukemia, you just open it up and then you just add the next term, whether it's another antibiotic, if it's another, I don't know, another procedure, if you want to add the transplant to it, whatever it is. If you keep that core group of headings as a saved search, it will save you time in the long run. And check again with your institutional library because they quite often have these saved, or the librarian will be more than willing to share their saved searches with you. So again, the 2 main ways of staying current are the actual alerts from the subject databases, or a lot of people go through eTalks, or sometimes you have services that will, skim the tables of content. You have to look at the comprehensiveness of the coverage. So in a database like a Medline or an Embase, you have thousands of journals that the Safe Search is scanning, whereas in a table of content, it may be more limited. So find out how many titles are actually covered, and is that giving you the coverage you need. In terms of delivery, it's email usually. And again, as I mentioned in the previous slide, decide how often you want to receive these updates, because there's nothing, I mean, we all have full inboxes, and if you just keep cluttering them up with the alerts, then it's just going to be that much worse. So this slide, I hesitated about putting it in, but I decided to leave it in because this is pearls of wisdom from researchers that I have known over the years. And what they, sort of the top 3 points that they mention are, schedule some time to sit and think. In one of the earlier slides, I said, well, these are the questions I would ask you if you came to me for a search. Think about it before you embark on the search, and just sometimes just sit and think about all the logical or illogical connections that perhaps would be there if you undertook a specific search question. Schedule some time to meet with colleagues or collaborators, lunch or coffee. I know everybody eats at their keyboard and they're picking the seeds from their granola bars out of the keys, but it really is fostering an environment, and you get to bounce ideas off people. That's certainly what I found when anyone would come to me for a search. They sometimes would bounce ideas off of me, and I would ask questions because I didn't know the answers. And it can sometimes lead to a different train of thought. And reading the popular literature, the cure of the week, that the articles are embargoed and certain journals come out on a certain day of the week, and there's your cure, right? So keep up with that literature as well. For the citation management software, most of you have a preferred software. This is just an example of the freeware versus the commercial. If you're a reference manager user, it was discontinued in May of 2016. Sort of the top product seems to be EndNote. Most groups are using it. Certainly with EndNote X7 and 8, you're able to concurrently work and share your library with collaborators, which is a huge step forward. The others, Mendeley, Zotero, or freeware, they've been around for a long time, and most people are product loyal. So I'm not going to try and convince you one way or the other which one you should use, but certainly they do make your life easier. And remember, mental health, yours. Once you find those articles, it's really nice to organize them properly. So here are some of the reasons why you would want to use the citation management software. The main thing is that it now gives us one place to keep everything. and preferably saved on a network drive so that you have the references, you have the PDF copies linked to it, and they're linked in one place as opposed to cluttering up your hard drive. And you can use it to share the references with others and or do analysis. So let's say it's a systematic review. You can even generate your inclusion and exclusion notes and organize your references that way. And, of course, the icing on the cake, using it to cite while you write. And that has revolutionized and helped reference work in libraries immensely, because we don't have anywhere near the number of wrong references, incorrect references that we had in the old days when you used to type all the references in. So in conclusion, use your database subject headings first. Add text words as required. Consider adding text words for age groups, but usually the age group limits in most databases are sufficient. Consider the quality filters as required. I find in pediatrics, I always found that limiting to randomized control trials didn't always cut it. Multi-center studies were better, and cohort studies usually gave us some results. Even if they were just retrospective studies, the chart reviews, that's the nature of some of the subjects or some of the populations. Consider all languages. You never know when there's some gem that was published in another language. Consider all publication years. I've given you the example of that one time that they missed finding the really relevant article. And save your frequently searched terms as a safe search to minimize your searching time. And again, all subject headings are different from database to database. No shortcut. Select them. Okay, so going back to our objectives, I hope I've been able to convey to you the importance of using either PICO or Concept Map, the top 3 databases, Cochrane, Medline, and Embase at a minimum. Subject headings, what you're getting with the subject heading is the contents, the guts of the article, as opposed to just words that were used in the title or the abstract. The pillars, diagnosis, therapy, prognosis, causation, harm. The quality filters, I've already mentioned study designs and types you're more than familiar with, and to automatically update your searches whenever possible. It does save you time in the long run. And I guess citation management, mental health, and mental health, yours. So I thank you for your attention. If you have to leave, by all means do. And I'm open to any and all questions that you may have. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I don't know if we're still on mute. Maybe Randy will unmute us. Randy? There, I'm unmuted. There we go. So I just wanted to say thank you, Elizabeth.
Unmuted.
I've heard you deliver this talk on numerous occasions, of course, and I feel like I learn stuff every time. So I just get that we're running short on time. I will open the floor for questions if anyone who's attending has any questions for Elizabeth. Well, it doesn't sound like there's many questions forthcoming, Elizabeth, but I do want to thank you. I think, you know, just clarifying again the difference between Medline and Embase is always so important. And I think your search example just really described how you have to keep all of these various things in mind about trying to find it, right? I think most of us would sort of attack the problem in one way, but you showed using 3 different ways actually provides a much better search. So thank you again. Sorry.
This is Victor Lewis, Calgary. I just have a quick question. It may sound quite dumb, but Elizabeth,
there are no dumb questions. There are no dumb questions in searching.
So, you know, I've been doing searches, obviously, for what I do, and it's always been Medline and whatever it links to. How does one get to Embase? This is the first time I've even heard of it.
Okay, so you're at University of Calgary?
That's right.
I would go to the university website, and I'm pretty sure that they have Ovid Embase.
Oh, they do? Yeah, I didn't know. So Ovid, so yes, I've used Ovid, so that's the same thing?
Well, Ovid is the search aggregator. So the way that it works is that there are database supplier or providers. So they are the ones who do the indexing. So the National Library of Medicine indexes and compiles the Medline database. Elsevier indexes and compiles the EvidenceBased database, and so on. And then they either have their own search platform, so in Medline it's PubMed, or they will sell the contents, the database, to various aggregators. So Ovid is an aggregator, EBSCOhost is an aggregator, and so on down the line. And what you're doing is that you're using that search interface, so the Ovid search interface, to search the databases that your institution has subscribed to. So I believe that they have Medline and EvidenceBased and probably PsycInfo and a few others. So the advantage of learning the one search interface, like let's say Ovid, is that the front page or the search screen looks the same, but the databases behind it are slightly different, but the fields are the same so that you can go in and run your search quite effectively. And then you would just download your results. So Ovid EvidenceBased is probably the one you have in Calgary. There is Elsevier also puts out EvidenceBased on their own platform. It's called EvidenceBased.com. So it's a slightly different look to the search page, but it does the same thing. Okay, you're using the subject headings to find your results. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, Elizabeth, just following up on that, because I know when I go into Ovid, for example, here at the University of Toronto, I can select the multiple databases and basically search.
Don't do that.
Well, so that's what I was asking. So that's a no-no, right? Because that would conflict with your number 2 rule, which was you can't use the same search subject headings across the databases, correct?
That's correct. And
okay.
For all of those databases use ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, or DSM-5. They have slight variations on the terms, and it doesn't end well, ever.
Okay, so I should always create a search for an individual database, even though I'm using an aggregator like Ovid, and then create a separate search for a second database. That's
right, and save them, and always use in Ovid, use the search tools option to find your subject headings.
Okay.
Because that will lead you systematically to what headings are available. So you start with the permuted.
Yes.
And then click on it, check the scope note, then go to the tree or the thesaurus and determine what other additional terms you need to add.
That's good.
Elizabeth,
yes?
Victor Lewis again at University of Calgary. So, there are these programs, apps available which you can put on your iPad, because most of us are doing those. And I'm not talking about these really detailed searches that, for example, you get involved in. We're just sitting, in rounds and we need to pull up something. So there are things like bookends and EndNote Lite and all those sorts of things. I use bookends for what I do. Do you know or recommend any specific apps that one can use in a much better way because it links up to certain databases that you feel would provide us better information?
Well, I can't give you a specific example. My experience with apps has been that they, if you can imagine a pipe that's maybe, 10 centimeters across, and if you think of the app, it's maybe only 6 centimeters across. There is search functionality that you lose with the apps. And the apps have to be able, the biggest determinant of any of these apps is what are the licensed databases that you have available in your institution that you will be able to access with the app. And I know that there is an incompatibility between some apps and some of the search interfaces. So you're getting a search, but you're not necessarily getting the whole picture.
I see.
Okay. So no, I can't, but I think for quick searches, if you can go in even through PubMed, that's probably the more consistent way in. But I would check, actually, the best recommendation I can probably give you is if you go to the library and ask them which app, because I know, excuse me, in my own experience, people would phone us that, X, Y, or Z is not working, how come? And that's when we would be able to tell them, well, these are the problems with, this particular app or that one, and your library will certainly be up on those issues. Sometimes it's also a network issue, maybe not so much at the university, but I know in hospitals with firewalls, we had all sorts of strange things going on that should have worked and didn't. And also with Macs, that's the other thing. I did forget to mention that in the presentation, but with Macs, if you a Macintosh computer, if you use the Safari browser, it also does not play well with a lot of sites. So certain certain links may be grayed out. You're better off with a more generic browser like Chrome or Firefox. They seem to be less offensive to some sites, and this is primarily with Macs, and I don't understand why. I mean, it's a fabulous software, and it works so well in general, but there's just something about the browser and the way that the journal and database sites are formatted, that, and it's random. It's not consistent for each one. So so try and avoid Safari if you're on a Mac or an iPad.
Great. Well, I think we'll leave it there because I think we've run a little bit over time, but the questions were great, and clearly people are very interested. So, Elizabeth, again, it's my pleasure to thank you on behalf of the Research Champion Group of the CYP-C program for coming and presenting today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And we thank you very much, and we look forward for those who attended to the next sessions in May. We'll be sending out some information on those sessions coming up shortly. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.